Got him. Big one. Oh my gosh, I don't know what this is. Oh man, well that's one way to catch him right there. What's up y'all, welcome back to Fish the Moment. Today I'm gonna teach you how to fish a flutter spoon for bass offshore in the summertime. And we're gonna be talking about how to retrieve the bait, when, where, and how to fish it, and also how to catch these fish in the mouth. That happens a lot of times you're fishing the spoon, guys. They'll swipe at it and you'll kind of hook them in the side, but he's all good. And that is a really nice fish here to start this video. Let's go, flutter spoons, baby. Now that we know what a flutter spoon is, let's talk about when to fish it. And a flutter spoon is designed to be fished on offshore structure, and you're actually going to cast the flutter spoon out away from the boat. This is not a vertical jigging spoon that you'll fish directly underneath your boat. You're actually going to cast this out onto offshore structure like humps, ledges, and points, and then work it back to the boat by ripping it aggressively with your rod off the bottom and letting it fall back down to the bottom. And the flutter spoon is great when bass are schooled up offshore on deep areas, and you might have anywhere from 10 to 100 bass on a piece of structure or cover. And a lot of times these bass are going to be suspended offshore, sitting anywhere from 3 to 5 feet off the bottom. And when these fish are suspended, a lot of times they won't bite your traditional bottom baits like a crankbait or a jig. And therefore you have to fish a bait that actually is worked off the bottom anywhere from 3 to 5 feet to get those fish to bite. Therefore, a flutter spoon is a very situational bait, and I'm not going to throw it on every single offshore spot I find. And I'm actually going to use the image on my down imaging to determine if I'm going to throw that spoon or not. And so here's some examples. In this first example, we have an offshore ledge, and there's a school of bass sitting on the edge of this ledge, and a lot of these fish are suspended 3 to 5 feet off the bottom. In this situation, I tried to start by fishing a football jig and a crankbait on these fish and never got a bite. And after I thought about how these fish were positioned, I decided to pull out the flutter spoon, and on my first cast, I caught a fish on this exact spot and then proceeded to catch several more. And a flutter spoon is great because it will actually trigger these inactive schools of bass that won't bite other lures and will allow you to put a lot of extra fish in the boat as long as you're paying attention to how those fish are positioned on your down imaging. So again, they need to be 3 to 5 feet off the bottom of the drop. In this next example, you'll see another offshore ledge, and there's a school of bass that's positioned 5 to 8 feet off the bottom, and they're almost off the edge of the drop, more towards the creek channel than the top of the ledge. And on top of the ledge, there's a really nice brush pile, and a lot of guys would probably fish this brush pile with a jig or a Carolina rig or a drop shot, and completely ignore these bass that are suspended almost off the drop because they might not think they're catchable. And if you threw a jig or a crankbait down there, you wouldn't get bit. But if you pick up that flutter spoon and rip it up through those fish by letting the bait hit the bottom, rip it up off the bottom 5 to 8 feet and let it fall back through those fish, you'll get these fish to trigger. And I caught a ton of fish off this spot on back-to-back-to-back casts just because I was throwing the right bait to match the situation. Now, there are times when these bass might actually move and get in that brush pile, and a jig or a crankbait would be the better option, but in this situation, the flutter spoon was what you needed to get these fish to bite. And so, I might not throw a flutter spoon on the spot in every situation. The reason I'm throwing it here is because those bass are suspended off the bottom and closer to the edge of the drop, and if I wasn't throwing it, I wouldn't get them to bite. So again, a flutter spoon is a tool in your toolbox, but it's not the only bait you need to be throwing offshore. What is a flutter spoon? And it's basically just a big hunk of metal with a treble hook hanging off of it. And this flutter spoon has a concave shape which allows them to catch water as they fall through the water column, and they'll move side to side imitating a fleeing or dying bait fish. And bass cannot stand them when they're in an inactive mood. And my go-to flutter spoon is a Strike King 5.5 inch sexy spoon. And there are a bunch of different sizes of spoons on the market. You have the 5.5 inch sexy spoon, there's a 4.5 inch version of that same spoon. You have the 6 inch Lake Fork tackle spoon, which is a little bit wider, a little bit longer, and then your Magnum spoons like this Jenko Fishing 8 inch flutter spoon, and then there's some 10 and 12 inch spoons as well. And all of these flutter spoons basically are designed to imitate either a gizzard shad or a threadfin shad, and they're meant to be fished offshore. And so I usually pick the size of my spoon depending on the size of the bait fish I'm around. If I'm around some decent sized gizzard shad or threadfin shad, the 4.5 to 5.5-inch spoons are perfect, and I would say that a 5.5-inch spoon is a really good starting point regardless of the size of forage you have. But if you have some smaller forage, then maybe going to that 4.5-inch spoon, get a few more bites, and then as you get those bigger gizzard shad, a lot of times that 8 to 10-inch spoon can trigger some of those bigger bass to bite just because they're targeting those 8 and 10-inch gizzard shad. And so all of these spoons are equally effective. It just depends on the forage you have in your lake. And as you can see, these spoons come in a variety of different colors. Some of them have some blue on the top of them, red, black, green, yellow. I've seen all kinds of different colored spoons. But the key for these spoons really is just to have a chrome finish. And most spoons anyways will just have a chrome back and they'll have a painted front. And so I don't get too worried about the color of my spoon as long as it has a nice chrome finish that's going to catch the sun and flash as it falls. And another big key with fishing flutter spoons is that you want to make sure that you use the right hardware on that spoon. These spoons have a tendency to create a lot of line twist and also have a tendency to fall out of the fish's mouth when they jump. And so you want to make sure you set up your spoon properly so that you're not having a miserable time fishing them. A couple of modifications I do to my spoons when I get them out of the package is first to upgrade the stock treble hook on the spoon. I like to go to a either size 1 or a 1/0 extra wide gap treble hook, and I don't like to throw the short shank heavy duty treble hooks. I like the just regular strength, a little bit lighter wire hooks with a longer shank to them, but I want that extra wide gap on the hook to make sure that I really pin those fish, and I want to up that hook size a little bit from the stock size. So if the regular spoon has a size 2 hook, you want to put a 1 or a 1/0. If you're throwing these Magnum spoons, you may want to go to a 2 or a 3/0 treble hook just to get a really good hookup on those fish. The smaller the hook is, the more leverage those fish will have to actually throw that hook out of their mouth when they jump, and with a big hunk of metal hanging out of their mouth, they will throw this bait pretty easily. So upgrade that treble hook. And another thing you need to do when you get your spoon is to make sure that you put on a swivel to your split ring or tied directly to that spoon. This swivel will prevent a lot of line twist that is very common with this flutter spoon, and it will just save you from having an awful time casting it and retrieving it. So always put that barrel swivel on your spoon and upgrade that stock treble hook, and you're pretty much ready to go. The only other thing I might do is put a little stinger hook just above the hook or above the knot on my spoon and just kind of put it on the line. I do that maybe 30% of the time if the fish are missing the spoon a lot, but that'll also get a lot of extra hang-ups for you. So I would just recommend going with one treble hook, and that's barrel swivel, 5.5-inch to 8-inch spoon, and you're going to be good to go. In terms of the equipment I use with this flutter spoon, I like to use a 7'4" to 7'6" heavy action rod with an extra fast tip when I'm fishing flutter spoons between 4 to 6 inches in size. You want a pretty long rod with a heavy action because these spoons are heavy and you're going to be casting them out into deep water and ripping them off the bottom, and so you need extra leverage with a longer rod, and the heavy action rod helps you really drill the hook into those fish. And I've tried to experiment with some moderate action rods or maybe like a crankbait rod because I'm throwing these spoons with treble hooks, but I find that I just don't get the hook setting power with those type rods. So just going to like a regular flipping stick works really well with these flutter spoons. And when I actually upsize to an 8 or a 10-inch spoon, I just go to a little bit longer rod. I'll go to a 7'11" heavy action rod to help me cast that bait a little bit better and also help me retrieve it a little bit easier. And I'm always throwing these flutter spoons with 17 to 20 pound fluorocarbon line. You don't want to throw monofilament line because mono has a lot of stretch and it will make it very difficult to rip that spoon off the bottom and actually feel those bites when those fish eat it. And so use fluorocarbon, and don't be afraid to use heavy line with these spoons because the spoons are basically just big hunks of metal and they're going to be flashing a lot, and those bass are not going to be paying attention to your line at all. So just go to that 17 to 20 pound line and it'll help you swing those fish in when you get them hooked and also avoid any break-offs. And I'll just pair that with a 6:4 to 1 gear ratio reel, or maybe even like a 7 to 1, doesn't matter that much. And that's pretty much it. That's my setup. So now let's talk about when and where to fish this flutter spoon, as well as the retrieve and how to cast the thing. In terms of where I fish a flutter spoon, I'm throwing it on offshore ledges about 80% of the time. And I've actually made a complete guide to ledge fishing. It's on my channel, and I would definitely check that out. I was actually catching them on a flutter spoon in that video and explained exactly what a ledge looks like and how to find them on a contour line map. But I also catch a lot of fish on the flutter spoon on offshore points and humps and areas where I find bass suspended on my graph 3 to 5 feet off the bottom. But the big thing that I always look for when I'm fishing a flutter spoon are schools of bass that are anywhere from 10 to 12 bass big. I usually don't catch a lot of isolated bass with a flutter spoon. It's usually a bait that I throw when I find a school of bass offshore. So now that you know the equipment you need to use to fish a flutter spoon, let's talk about the retrieve. So all you have to do is basically just cast that thing out there, which is sometimes easier said than done because that spoon will catch the wind. And then once that bait's out there, you want to let it sink all the way to the bottom. And that's really important. You want to let that bait get all the way down there, which means sometimes giving your bait some line, letting it get down to the bottom, and watching your line as it falls. And you can tell that that bait is on the bottom because your line on the surface will stop moving. That slack line there on the surface of the water will stop going forwards. That means it's on the bottom. Then what I do is actually reel my line up so that I have a pretty tight line between my bait and the reel. And what I'll do after my line is tight and my bait's in the bottom is give it 2 hard jerks, almost like a hook set, straight into the air. And I'm gonna do this over and over again. So I'm just gonna pop my rod up like that into the air and hop that spoon off the bottom. The whole key of this bait's action is the way that bait falls in the water. You're not gonna get very many bites when that bait's on the bottom or dragging across the bottom. The way you get your bites is after you jerk that bait up, that spoon will fall back down and shimmy to the side and kind of imitate a fleeing bait fish. And so the harder and the more erratic you can jerk that spoon up off the bottom, the better you're going to do. And you can jerk the spoon in one pull like this, which I find to be a little bit difficult and straining. And so instead what I'll do is I'll just do 2 quick jerks like that. It works for me, and I've been doing it for years and catch a lot of fish that way, but you can kind of choose which way works best for you. And I'm literally just ripping that spoon up off the bottom as hard as I can. And one thing I'm doing after I rip up that spoon is I'm carefully watching my line, because the bites in the spoon are not going to be this big like jerk where they pull the rod out of your hand. What it'll be is almost like a crappie bite where you'll just feel a small tick on the end of your line. That will tell you that that fish has that spoon. And if you feel a tick, boom, set the hook like that, and you're gonna have that fish on. So one thing that a lot of guys struggle with a flutter spoon is actually casting it, especially in the wind, because this bait will fly everywhere. And a lot of guys will try to cast it just like they will a deep diving crankbait or a football jig. They'll go straight over their head and cast it up into the sky. And sometimes on a day like this, when it's nice and calm, that'll work. Other times it will blow behind your boat, in your face. It's kind of dangerous actually, so I don't recommend casting straight over your head. So instead of casting straight over my head at a 90-degree angle, I'll actually cast more at a 45-degree angle or over my right shoulder. And so it's not really a sidearm cast, it's more of like a 45-degree angled cast. And while I'm doing this, I'm going to make sure I keep my elbows really close to my sides. This will actually make the bait go a little bit lower and pierce into the wind, and this will allow it to cut through all of the wind and breeze that might catch the spoon. And so when you cast this 45, that bait goes at a much lower trajectory, it cuts through that wind, and it can go on target a lot more often, which will help you make a lot more productive casts with this flutter spoon. Oh! One just smoked it right there. That happens all the time, guys. I'll be hopping that spoon, and as it's falling back down, I'll feel one hit it. But when I set the hook, they're not there. And what happens is that these fish will actually try to kill this spoon rather than eating it. And as you saw from that pool footage, that bait has such a wide side-to-side action that those fish will sometimes kind of miss the target, not get the hook or get the spoon fully in their mouth. They'll just slap the side of it and you'll feel them, but you won't get a hook in them. And then sometimes you actually do get a hook in them when you set the hook, like that first fish I caught. And I'm not trying to do that, obviously. That's just an accident. But what happens is that when they miss that spoon, a lot of times they'll think that they injured it. And so what I'll do is actually keep my spoon down there and just hop it a few feet off the bottom, but not nearly as erratically, and try to get that fish to come back and eat that spoon again. And a lot of times those bass are still in that same area and they think that that bait is now injured. And so if you just hop it a little bit softer in place right where they bit it, a lot of times they'll come back, eat it again, and you'll get that fish in the boat. Well guys, that's it for this video. Hopefully you learned something about how to fish a flutter spoon in the summertime. It is a really effective bait for triggering inactive schools of bass and catching those suspended bass on tough fishing days like this. And so if you enjoyed, please leave a like down below and also subscribe to the channel if you want more fishing tutorials and fishing instruction videos like this. And if you have any questions, leave a comment down below and I'll try to get back to you. So thanks again for checking out the video. I'll see y'all next one.